Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and today on Theosophia Esoteric Studies, we have the one, the only Lynne Miceli of the EDGAR Cases, ARE, and NYC. Greetings, Lynne.
Greetings. Thank you, Hercules. It's nice to be here. And my guest tonight is Peter Woodbury, one of the most popular speakers and teachers in the ARE community. And we're going to be talking about the archetype of the apocalypse. So welcome, Peter.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Nice to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Peter has an MSW and is a psychologist, a hypnotherapist, and a past life regressionist. He was introduced to Edgar Cayce during his college years and has served on the staff of the ARE for a number of years. Not now, but he was on the staff for a number of years. For anybody out there who doesn't know, Edgar Cayce was an American psychic and mystic who lived from 1877 to 1945 and gave over 14,000 psychic readings on a whole myriad of topics ranging from health and healing to reincarnation, karma, ancient cultures, technical inventions, future prophecy, and so on. So a whole lot of what you call the natural health movement may derive, at least in part, from Edgar Cayce, as well as a lot of New Age concepts. The organization that preserves and shares all this information is the ARE, which stands for the Association for Research and Enlightenment. And Peter became one of the most sought-after speakers for ARE groups all over the U.S. He teaches courses in past life regression, his own special technique of past life regression, which he calls soul contact. Also teaches life coaching. He has a past life regression course coming up on August 26th, which we can maybe talk a little bit about if we have time at the end. Peter also leads amazing tours to sacred sites around the world and is going to be doing one to mystical Turkey coming up this fall. And in 2026, he'll be leading tours to Egypt and Peru. But tonight, we're talking about a topic Peter's presented a number of times, the archetype of the apocalypse. And for this, he draws a lot on the Edgar Cayce readings, because Cayce did a series of readings on the biblical book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse. He's also drawing on the work of Carl Jung and a book by a Jungian psychologist, Edward Edinger, which is titled The Archetype of the Apocalypse, Divine Vengeance, Terrorism, and the End of the World. Even the title is a little scary. So Peter, thank you for being my guest tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
When Edinger published that book in 1999, he was seeing a lot of signs around him of what he thought of as an apocalypse. And when you recorded your presentation some months ago, there were some signs, but right now, the topic seems more timely than ever before in my memory. What do you think about that?
Well, Edinger was referring to Carl Jung's material also, who originally was talking about the archetype of the apocalypse, which he was talking about it. I guess he passed away in 1961, I think. So this the constellation, as Jung calls it, it's been in place for some time, but sometimes I think of it like astrology, that you have to have these certain elements, like certain influences in place for this archetype to be activated. And so I think it's been activated for a while, but we're seeing more and more of these constellating elements that are in our midst, which are bringing forth this archetype.
And Edinger starts out in his book by defining the words archetype and apocalypse. So maybe that's a good place to start. I thought I knew what those things meant, but actually,
yes,
the definitions were helpful.
Yeah, well, the apocalypse, a lot of times people think that means the end of the world, whereas apocalypse and revelation are analogous. And sometimes it's called the book of Revelation or the book of the apocalypse. And a revelation or apocalypse just means that something has been kept secret or has been unknown and comes into awareness. And this awareness creates a disruption and a judgment. And then there's in the long run, it's a good thing. So it's just something that needs to come up. It comes up. We have to face it. And then the after effect is better than what was leading up to the apocalypse. So that would be my kind of patchwork definition of an apocalypse. And then an archetype is basically a pattern, a subconscious pattern that sometimes I think of it like the tarot. You have the major arcana, which represent, I would say, archetypes. And so when I was doing the work, I was saying, did Edgar Casey ever talk about archetypes? But when he talks about the Christ consciousness, he pretty much defines it in a very Jungian way as that pattern that's imprinted in the mind, awaiting to be awakened by the will of our soul's oneness with God or creative forces. So he's basically saying that we all have the Christ consciousness pattern within all of us, or the archetype. And Jung just talked about many more archetypes. And interestingly enough, what I found really, many things were impressive from Edinger's work, but one of the things was that Carl Jung said that nothing can come into being without it first being a pattern, without it first being an archetype. So it's, when Casey says choose thou, it's really not create thou, it's choose thou, because we're choosing from, choose to follow the Christ archetype or the Antichrist archetype. All these are just choices that we have to make. We're not really creating new archetypes or creating new patterns. I found that very interesting.
So we're kind of hooking into existing patterns, but then we're expressing them in our own unique way.
I guess so. I mean,
yeah.
Let's say the mother archetype, of course, a mother there's infinite numbers of mothers of expression of the mother archetype, but it's in essence that pattern that I guess, like you're saying, a person fulfills it with their own flavor of how they express it. Like the Christ consciousness, how we express it. You could say Jesus expressed it quite fully, and maybe each one of us are trying the best we can to express that archetype.
Yeah, I think that bears repeating. A pattern imprinted on the mind, waiting to be wakened by the will of the soul's oneness with God. And this, according to Casey, is inside of every one of us, waiting to. And then Casey, I know this doesn't come from the readings on the Revelation or from the Book of Revelation, but there is a reading about the Antichrist too, which is similar in that Casey seems to be describing something like an archetype.
Yes, and what I took from it, I grew up Catholic, and I used to think that Christ was Jesus's last name. Like the mailbox was Joseph, Mary, and Jesus Christ. The 111 whatever Appian Way or something. So that it took me a while, or maybe it was perhaps through Casey, that I realized that Christ was a consciousness that Jesus attained. And then it's a consciousness that we're all, like you said, we all have within us, and we're all in some ways trying to express or ignore. But then there's also the Antichrist consciousness, which is you could say that the Christ consciousness is that of oneness, and the Antichrist, or against the Christ, is that which is against oneness. So it would be about division, separation, lovers of self, lovers of praise, seeking conflict. All those are elements of that against the Christ consciousness. So you have the consciousness of oneness or unity, and you have the consciousness of separation and division. And then here you have other, here you have self.
And one of the things about an archetype is that it kind of has a life of its own. It's almost like something alive, and it can sort of possess individuals.
Yes.
And Casey, about the Antichrist, I wrote this down. He said that the Antichrist is the spirit of that opposed to the spirit of truth, and that it can take possession of groups, masses, and show itself even in the lives of men. So while Casey's not talking about an individual who is the Antichrist, um, there could
It's like
be,
a virus. It's like a great virus that can take
uh-huh,
over your subconscious mind.
and not just of an individual, but of a group or a mass of people.
Yeah, and I think
And
you might you could say you saw that in Germany with Hitler.
exactly.
That was an antichrist spirit that took over masses.
So Edinger initially talks about an apocalypse being something that happens on an individual level as a like a psychological event, where the individual's world is, he knows it's kind of falling apart, and in that
Oh,
process the true self is emerging. So is that
yeah.
about right?
Yes. Well, I assume, have you seen the apocalypse in your life in the last 5, 10 years? Have you seen something come to light that you've had to deal with, and it's been a big disruption and perhaps caused a lot of upset, and then you've had to make some significant changes, and then perhaps you're better off because of it. Like sometimes it could be a divorce, it could be a revelation of an affair, something like that. I certainly have gone through that, as you well know, in my professional life. I think we all went through a sort of apocalyptic experience with ARE, and we're all hopefully on the other side of it, hopefully learned something from it and gained from it.
But if we're talking about it as more than a personal event, and if it's a collective event, how do you see that? How does that
Well,
play
well,
out?
collective events they involve individuals, so they have to influence individuals to then participate in masses in groups to become a collective. And I think that, let's say what the constellation, like Edgar talks about, is that of course we're seeing wars and conflicts around the globe. And then we're seeing earth changes and climate changes and storms and things like that we really haven't seen before. The solar storms are now getting categorized at a higher level, and hurricanes having to get categorized at a higher level. I think there's just a number, in the way that the economic struggles that the world is going through, and the move towards fascism, or that we see around the globe towards more and more control. I think all of these are elements, I think largely being triggered by fears. So I think that the archetype of the apocalypse collects masses because of a fear-based sort of thinking. And then, when it activates in the shadow, as Jung would say, and then it has to get projected. So there has to be an external enemy. So Hitler used the Jews as the externalization of his own, conflicted self. He had to put it on someone else. And I think we're seeing that quite active in our world now, where there's finger pointing and blaming going on, not just in our country, but in many parts of the world.
But then there's supposed to be, like in the Book of Revelation, while all these uh, frightening things are going on, or all these strange things are going on, there's this remnant that remains. They're kind of like the saving grace. They kind of remain faithful.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a beautiful concept, and I think it's one that is hope giving. Is that if there can be a saving remnant, and so the saving remnant is a group of individuals that can keep to what Casey would call ideals. If a group can, I think of it almost like the Ark of the Covenant, that if we can get this, if we can save ideals, if we can save the Christ consciousness active in small groups, that we can get it through this dark period, that then it can survive. It's almost like a flame, that if we can keep this flame through this storm, that there's hope that there can be another side of this. And then that flame can actually be like what Casey called, or what the Revelation talks about, as 1,000 years of peace, where the calamities have come, but that there's a new beginning. And this new beginning reflects kind of having learned from what needed to collapse, and rebuilding something that's much more in alignment with the Christ consciousness, or the oneness consciousness.
And Edinger has this idea, and you seem to share it, that that remnant, maybe the larger or the more conscious or dedicated, whatever that remnant is, they can mitigate this event not only for themselves, but maybe they can help to mitigate the whole thing. Is that do I have that about
Yes.
right?
But I do think that Jung and Edinger are not terribly I lost you.
That's that's
I didn't know
I knew
you
she
could
was
do
going to do
that.
that.
You
She's restless
disappear.
tonight. That's Rowena, the
Oh,
beautiful
okay.
Rowena.
Rowena.
Yes, go
Yeah, well,
on. I'm sorry.
Edinger and Jung um, are quite Jung was quite dramatic about even writing about this because he said that he really feared and Jung had visions of what the future could possibly look like, and Edinger certainly shares that the apocalypse is upon us, and our what we need to do now, according to their view, is to at least make it not be as the worst possible, which would be the annihilation of humanity on the earth. That's the worst of it. That's the danger. And the hope is that there can be enough folks that stay true to make it through the other side. So that's why Jung and Edinger did their work, was to try to get they said there's, I think one of his quotes quite strong where he says that nothing is more important now than a group of individuals that understand what's going on. Because I think that without understanding what's going on, sometimes I make it akin to like the first woman having getting pregnant, having a birth. She doesn't have the consciousness that a body is growing within her. Like nobody's told her that this is a natural process of creating and delivering a human. She'll see her abdomen growing. She thinks she's dying and that she has a terrible illness. And so that's sort of what our world is going through. It's going through this birthing process. And if enough people can realize that there's the potential for there to be a constructive birth and to somehow become part of that saving remnants, that's the hope for this. So that's what they're really trying to do, to get enough of us conscious so that we're not like chickens with our heads cut off and getting sucked into fear and arming ourselves with militia, trying to protect ourselves from all of our neighbors and digging bunkers and everything like that.
Yeah, you in your talk, you gave the example of after Martin Luther King was assassinated, that riots broke out in many cities, but I think you said it was Minneapolis. Did
Indianapolis.
Indianapolis,
Mhm.
and that was because RFK was actually there, and he
Yes.
told people, even though it was his personal loss, he quieted people down and kind of got them to react
Yeah.
differently.
He went, he was told to not, he was in Indianapolis, he was going to be at rallies, and he was told by his people to not do it, but he felt called to do it. And not only that, he went around Indianapolis with a bullhorn and giving his message, which basically saying, I know what it feels like to have lost somebody that you love more than I lost my brother to an assassin. But he says that the assassin who killed my brother was also white. So he was in a ways trying to say that it's, let's not make this completely about race if we can. And Indianapolis was the only city that didn't have serious riots. And I think that, like I said in that talk, that the Christ was with him, was working with him to do that. Like that was a beautiful thing to do, a beautiful movement to respond to. Like I think the archetype of the Christ, he responded to it.
So we know that RFK wasn't exactly a saint, but in that moment, you're saying he was kind of carrying the archetype of the Christ, and any one of us can carry that archetype
Yes, I think
temporarily or
God
permanently.
will. I always say that if God will work with me, God must be desperate. God will work with lots of people. So I think that certainly the Christ worked with RFK, and regardless of the foibles of the Kennedy family.
So we have about an hour, and we won't be able to talk about all the symbols of the revelation, but let's see how many we can talk about. One of the ones you started with was the lion and the lamb, and that seems kind of relevant to what we were just talking about, the potential for things to explode into violence, or the potential for things to be kept a little more gentle, like the
Yeah.
transition to be a little more gentle.
I think there's different ways to look at it, but for me, what resonates is the lion is the ego, you know, your self-importance and kind of projecting yourself, whereas the lamb is the soul consciousness. And if you can align your ego with your soul consciousness, then you give space for the expression of the Christ consciousness. I think when the lion lays down with the lamb, to me, that's what it means. Similar to the idea of an eclipse, where you get the sun, which is the God force, aligned with the moon, which is the ego force, and you have those. To me, that's the symbol of the Christ consciousness. That you know, CAYCE was asked, you know, that we've defined the Christ consciousness, but then he was asked, what does it look like? How would you define Christianity? And he said, it's to know yourself, to be yourself, and yet be one with God. So it's that you have your individuality, yourself, but
Here she comes again.
you align it with your God self. So I think that, you know, for those of us that are CAYCE or Christian, we see Jesus as the representative of that alignment of the ego and the soul forces.
Yeah, in your talk, you saw the lamb. You equated the lamb with the Jesus approach, which is traditional. Jesus as the lamb, but then you were talking about the lion as kind of like a Rambo character, and you were talking about how attractive that is. That kind of, you know, that approach. Like our society, we're drawn to that.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, if you look at the story of Rambo, you know, it's somebody is lost and he has to go in to save them, but he does so with violence, you know. So it's like it's a similar story to Jesus, but of course Jesus does it without violence, which is very puzzling to an ego consciousness. And it's really because, you know, if you're going to act from soul level, it's because you believe you're eternal. And that if you're going to act from the lion consciousness, it's just like all you have is this one little life, and you better get all you can, rather than thinking that this is just one moment and a reflection of eternity.
And so then the Whore of Babylon, and she rides a beast, right? I think, yeah.
Well, that's you know, CAYCE calls that's just selfishness in its extreme sense. And I think that's what we're seeing now in our society, that we have such a disparity between wealth and poverty. I think like almost like never before. And I think that in the past, when there's this, you know, CAYCE would say that's what would foment revolution. You know, they would have the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, where there was too big a disparity between wealth and poverty. But we can't have revolutions of that type now. So it's just getting farther and farther stretched apart. And so it's a little bit like you can only inhale so much before you have to exhale. And I think our society economically is at its breaking point. It can't go any further in the selfish greed dimension. You know the statistic. It's something like there's something like 6 families that possess something like 80% of the world's wealth. Like, it sounds preposterous. And then we have these billionaires that are making millions of dollars an hour. Can you imagine? And then of course they aren't quite generous. They're a lot of their staff are receiving state welfare benefits because their pays aren't sufficient. So that's the kind of the horror. I hate that to me it's misogynistic. It should probably be the pimp of Babylon. Might be better to make it not just a reflection of the feminine, but yeah, it's just the extreme selfishness, and then the certain people that reflect that. You know, like the Jesus was the person we most identify with the Christ consciousness, and of course we have individuals that we identify with the Antichrist consciousness.
And then, well, you know, you talked about misogyny, but then you also said, I think we've said that In Jungian psychology, there always has to be two sides of something. So the other side of that might be the other woman archetype from Revelation, the woman clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet, who gives birth, and she's pursued by the dragon.
Yes.
What do you see? How do you see that?
Well, you're right. That's the other feminine in that dyad, and that's us. That's us in our spiritual intention, that we're all in the process of trying to birth our Christ consciousness, but that it's pursued by the selfish and greed, dominance of our culture. Like, it's very hard, like right now economically, it's hard for anyone to have a job where the people that they're working for, or what it's feeding, doesn't come in some ways from that pimp of Babylon energy, that it controls our society.
Yeah, I know political action groups are trying to do boycotts of certain companies that they see as being particularly sort of horror Babylonish, but it's not that easy. It's not that easy, because things you need.
The
You
whole
you need
system,
certain things, and
the whole system is infected. Like, there's, it's what's the word? It's interconnected. So partly, the good and sad part is that like, you've probably heard or talked with Herb Purrier. He says, the controlling families of this world, which CAYCE talked about, they're not going to give up control just because it's a good thing to do. Things have to fall apart. Things have to collapse. And so that's where in the book of Revelation, it talks about how the business people begin to gnash their teeth. And some of that is because of, like you're saying, boycotts, where people just, stop wanting to participate in the economic systems that are a big part of the inequalities of our society.
well, ultimately it's unsustainable, because if the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, the poor can no longer buy the things that make the rich rich.
Exactly.
I don't know how they don't see that that ultimately well, anyway.
Well, they won't be happy until they get the last penny from the last person. It's like that. I think also people don't realize, top dog and underdog. I don't think underdog understands their power quite yet, and maybe that's going to come. Like there was a gentleman who used to come to speak at the ARE about sacred economics. And one of the things he said is, he says, I don't know why people buy new clothes. He says, you just go to these, thrift stores. There's enough clothes for, it's just there for pennies on the dollar. If everybody started shopping at thrift stores and stopped shopping at Macy's, that would have a big economic impact on the clothing industry. And I remember Charles Eisenstein, he looked like he shopped at the thrift shops, but he didn't care. He just had functional clothes. He wasn't trying to dress to impress. So that that's one of those. But those people are dangerous. I always think that one of the things I always say is that one of the main reasons they killed Jesus was because he was bad for business. Because he was saying, the temple is here within. You don't have to go to the temple outside you. It's within yourself. It's going to lose a lot of money if everybody believes that.
And he threw the money changers out of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He was bad for business. I never heard it put that way, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, because you're saying that it's not really possible to have a revolution at this time like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, and yet there is all this tremendous power in the the 99%, and yet you're saying they need to be. It ideally needs to be done in a Jesus-like way, like a not violence. So there's it's puzzling to see how it would happen, but you do see, you can't help seeing that things are headed to a crack up of some kind, a reckoning.
Well, I've thought that if if let's say if the working class folks got possessed with the Christ consciousness, and let's say they all decided to stop going to work, well, what's going to happen? What would happen to the world economy? It's like that. It's sort of like I think of Gandhi, who really tried to have a Christ consciousness in running the country, and how he dealt with the British. And so there was power in that. But there's always, I remember when there was in our country, we used to have strikes. That used to be a way that the workers could compensate, for when labor and in the business, when there were disparities, when there were conflict. Well, I remember when the air traffic controllers went on strike, they were all fired and replaced. So it became that was another kind of I think positive or nonviolent way of dealing with economic disparity. But that was taken away again because the ruling powers, they'll do whatever they can to prevent there being that movement towards equality. They don't want equality.
And yet it seems like it has to the whole concept of the apocalypse is that the old breaks down either violently or just collapses of its own
Yeah.
dysfunctional nature, and something new emerges. So I don't. It's hard to imagine anybody living in our society now who doesn't see the need for something new to emerge, no matter what their politics are. But this is related to that. Now, the archetype of the Tower of Babel.
Mhm.
I didn't even realize that was in the Revelation, but apparently it is
It's
mentioned.
not. I mentioned it. I discussed it. You probably picked it up in my talk. I just threw it in there because I think that it's related to what's going on in our society. Is that people aren't, we're bombarded with fake news, all sorts of outlets, and so it's just become, we don't know what to believe anymore. It's like the news media is owned by the vested interests of the controlling parties. So it's very hard for people to really get information that's credible. And I think what it does require us is that we're having more and more, like I think it was Thoreau who said, read the eternities, don't read the times. Like tune into yourself and read, your own access that you have to what's going on. So I think to survive these times, it's like Casey said, meditate, pray. That's how we can, express or develop the Christ consciousness, but also keep ourselves aware of what's truly going on, not what's going on over when we turn on the television or our laptops.
Yeah, one of the most disturbing things to me is that different parts of our society are living in completely different realities, completely different concept of reality.
Well, one of the things I see, Casey said this world is a dimension of testing, and one of the things that say, I hate to keep picking on Nazi Germany, but it's like the poster child of the Antichrist consciousness, is that, when one group was targeted, everyone was tested. What are you going to do about the Jews and of course the gay community and others, minorities? There were folks that said, well, we have to, if it's happening to them, it could happen to us. We have to help them. And some people say, well, it's not happening to me, so, I'll pray for them, but that's it. And I think that's what's going on in our society now, that if you see what's happening in our cities, what's happening with this supposedly crackdown on immigration and this everything that's going on with LGBT rights. Some people are saying, no, that's us, we're one. And some people are saying, well, I'm just going to pray it away. And basically a way of like saying, since it's not affecting me, I'm not really going to care about it. And I think that's one way that the controlling powers want people to think that,
Mhm.
if you're not those groups, we like you, like that that group, the Christian nationalists, they want white people to have kids. They don't want minority people having kids, so if they're almost like coming up with ways to financially support white people having children because they see Christian white nationalism. They think that the country should be supposedly whatever they define as Christian, and more like white supremacist. So that's what I see as a test, like like that where were you when they crucified my Lord? I think we're all asked, well, where are you? Where do you stand when the crucifixions are happening now in our midst?
And other symbols that you think are important in that in your discussion of the.
Well, it's like the book of Revelation is highly symbolic, and it's why it's so confusing. And Casey did such a wonderful job. I can't think of even Edgar and Jung in their work with the book of Revelation. I don't think it holds a candle to what Edgar Casey was able to interpret the book. I think they did the best a human being can do. Casey is really bringing in an amazing otherworldly interpretive ability. And so when he talks about the 1,000 years of peace, and he talks about the the devil being bound, and what I have taken for him to mean is that um, the way that souls came into this world was at first they came in by curiosity, they lost consciousness of being souls, and the world became very selfish. And then a second evolution came in to try to help out, but that didn't go so well. That's where we are now. So there's a second plan, which is that as we're going through this change time, Jesus talked about it. How did he put it? Truly, I tell you that all of this must come to pass before this generation can come to pass. So we're going through the karma of this entire generation, this entire age that has to be met, has to be cleansed in order for the next age to begin. So we're part of that clearinghouse of that energy. But then as that energy shifts, the devil being bound are those souls that have a certain, that they have a lot of karma that they've had to work with, and they're not going to resonate with the higher vibration that the earth is going to have for a while. And then it's going to get populated with higher vibrational souls. Casey said that it's like lights are coming into our world at this time, and that it'll be populated in, I always think of like what would it be like? Who are the nicest, most spiritual people I've ever met? And one of them was June Bro, and another was Diana Nadell. And I'm thinking, with the meek shall inherit the earth. We think of meek as weak, but to me, meek was like they would never hurt a fly, like they would never offend anyone. They would try everything they could to make the world a better place. And so I think, can you imagine a world with just those people, running the schools, running the businesses, everything would be would be really wonderful. And then the devil was released, meaning that those souls that have mixed karma eventually reincarnate, but then they're being born into a high vibrational world, and so that they have the tools and the resources to help themselves work through their conflicted issues. So that it seems to be what the plan is. How it
I love
goes,
that
we'll
plan.
see. Yeah.
I love that plan. I hope it works. I'd like to see it happen soon, but unfortunately, I don't get to choose the timing of these things. But the idea that, as you're saying, all the institutions, the schools, the families, the churches, they're all kind of now more or less living in the light. And then these other souls are allowed to come back in, and they get a second chance with like the best possible
Yes.
um, uh, influences around them.
Yes. Yes.
And yeah,
That's
but
the plan. But right
I,
now we've all chosen to live in this period of time where all the karma of this generation has to be met and cleared before, it has to be flushed down the toilet before. It can't, you can't pour old wine in new wineskins, is how it says in scripture. So this old energy can't go into the new energy. So we're here watching the clearinghouse of this energy clear itself out. And the way I see it is that, like Jesus said, brother will go against brother, and father against son, these sort of things. And I'll mention some names because I think it's, we had Donald Trump, and all of a sudden his best buddy, Elon Musk, and they're like, oh yeah, we love each other, but they're both not Christ conscious individuals. They're very selfish individuals. So what happens? They eventually want to kill, destruct on each other. They're both now become mortal enemies. So that to me is the what's happening, is that even these the how would you say, selfishness has the root of its own destruction within itself. If you look at organisms that really thrive, like ants, they're altruistic. Like, you don't have selfish society surviving. They have to be carrying up, each individual has to care about the whole for it to survive forward. So when you have all these people that really aren't thinking of the whole, they're thinking of themselves, they're ultimately self-destructive. So I think that's what we're here through. Jung thought it would be about several hundred years. And, if you look at soul, the soul is eternal. I would say each lifetime is like a day in the life of the soul. So I'd say we're like 5 days or a week away from this, which would be about 500 or 700 years. I don't think we're on the cusp of anything. Now, there is some interesting, CAYCE talked about 1958 to 1998 as this period of testing. And then there's this opposite 40 years, 1998 to 2038. And of course, John Van Auken wrote about the pyramid calendar, according to CAYCE, which runs to 2038. The Mayans also talk about 2038. So I think all of us have chosen to incarnate in this 80-year cycle, because I do think that there's something important that probably the worst of it, I don't know, there's something that if we can get to 2038, there's a lot more hope than I guess what could happen between now and then. So it's almost like that's the cusp. I don't know if there's going to be multiple cusps. I don't know how it works, but I think that us, perhaps as part of this generation, are here in this period of time. So I oftentimes look towards 2038, and with the hope that all of us, that the saving remnants, can make some positive influence to get us there and to keep that flame going. When at the beginning of this year, after the election, I knew within myself I was seeing my own Christ consciousness diminishing because of the anger and the lower vibrational energies that I myself was feeling in those around me. And so I formed a shadow group where we were able to try to look at what was getting kicked up for ourselves and what we were projecting. And that was very helpful. I still feel it's hard, it's hard to bear witness to everything that's going on. But I think that bearing witness is very important rather than putting your head in the ground.
Two things. You've mentioned the shadow a couple of times, and maybe a lot of people are familiar with that, but maybe we should also explain what Jung meant by the shadow.
The shadow are the aspects of ourselves that we find unacceptable, and so that we repress them. We don't think of them as being part of us. So it might be just our neediness, or our own selfishness, or our own greediness. Maybe there are aspects of ourselves that aren't of the light, I would say collectively the shadow is that blaming others for our own problems. So a shadow aspect is that not wanting to take responsibility for our own lives and always looking for a scapegoat. That would be
So,
one of them. But the shadow also has constructive aspects because it also it accesses energies that can be constructive and artistic and creative. So it's important to integrate the shadow, the parts of yourself that you don't like about yourself, that you want to put behind you. Like, I'm a good, loving, kind person, but those people out there, they're bad. Like, I'm not a rapist. They out there are the rapists. That's a shadow projection.
right. So, yeah. So a refusal to acknowledge aspects of the self, and then instead of seeing them in yourself, projecting them on others and hating them there.
Right.
It's, yeah.
You see it with kids, like when they go to school, um, they all feel insecure about themselves. So that's why kids at school find a scapegoat and bully one kid, and every other kid feels relieved that their weak aspects aren't seen and that they can project it onto someone else. So it's even in childhood, we work with that energy. You probably remember from school, like there was always a kid that was the scapegoat that everybody thought wasn't worthy or was weird or something like that. But the truth was, all of the kids felt weird. None of them felt like completely good about themselves.
There's another symbol that when you were talking about families being like families being turned against one another, or you use the example of Trump and Musk, who were, closest buddies,
Bros.
and then,
Yeah.
blew apart. There's a symbol, the the Son of Man appears, I think it's right at the beginning of Revelation, with a sword, a double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. And I think that has to do with this whole idea of separating, like there has to be a separating of things before everything can come together in oneness, right?
Yeah, and the words that were going to come forth were going to be sharp and cutting, and that they
Mhm.
weren't, it's like a part of the awakening is those things that are sweet in the mouth but bitter in the stomach. Meaning, there's a lot of things about the Christ consciousness that we can say, like, oh, love everybody for everything. But when it turns out to be that person that cut you off in traffic, or your brother-in-law, then it's bitter in the stomach, because in practice it's harder to do that. And I think that's what you, like, let's say with the Search for God groups, they were, to me, they were like support groups for being able to manifest the Christ consciousness, and having a place where you could express your shadow, like how hard it was to do that, and the elements of us that are not love and are not perfect, like you were saying about Robert Kennedy, the aspects of him that were weak or were frail, or felt, if you're a sex addict or a womanizer, you feel tremendously insecure about yourself. So that's I feel insecure about myself, so I have to have lots of conquests, and it's never enough. And that's, I'm trying to always prove my manhood, and
Right.
nothing, it doesn't get proved through conquests. It has to be proved within my own soul.
And there's this focus on light. One of the things that um, Edinger talks about is like this super focus on light as opposed to darkness, and yet the Jungian idea is that we all have light and darkness in us, and we have to learn to bring them together and sort of incorporate them as a whole, in a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think Casey does a good job with that. I think when he talks about Jesus's past lives, and he talks about, Jesus's misdirections, especially as Joshua, and the price he had to pay as Jesus for his actions as Joshua. That Joshua loved God but was vengeful, and so Joshua was a Jewish general, and he'd go into these corrupt little city nations, and he hated corruption, and he loved God, and so he'd take the kings of these little corrupt nations and he'd string them up on a tree. And you could read this in Joshua, and he'd have the people spit on the king, that, and he'd join them, and then he'd kill them and throw him in an unmarked grave. And he did this countless times. But what CAYCE said is that it's almost like Joshua was a zealot, that he loved God so much, he was a little perverted. He thought that this was the way to please God. And so, he had to learn in between lives. And if you look at like, getting strung up on a tree, getting spit on, and then thrown into an unmarked grave, CAYCE said that was part of Jesus's karma from Joshua that he was meeting. So that shadow aspect that he carried from Joshua, which he had worked through, but it was still there. It was still there to be faced. We could debate whether, I don't think Jesus necessarily had to face that because he had done so much, but I think that the crucifixion served so many other purposes that it wasn't just for his own personal karma. But it certainly can be seen that way. It makes sense that way.
I just want to backtrack a little bit for whoever's watching this, because they may not be CAYCE people. They might not be ARE
right, that's
people.
right.
And so there's a couple of things. Peter's talking about the past lives of Jesus, which there were, according to CAYCE, he did have past lives, and CAYCE talked about a number of them, and Joshua was a key past life. And he was you could say he was kind of a savior of his people, but more in the Rambo vein than in the Christ consciousness vein. No, some of both, but more like the man of action and violence. And then Peter also mentioned Search for God study groups, which one of the staff at ARE, Judith Stevenson, and I once did a whole program about the Search for God groups, but I'll just briefly explain that these are small groups that get together and study a series of CAYCE readings that were kind of like lessons, basically lessons in spiritual development, and support one another in their spiritual development. And it's not just studying the material, but they read from the Search for God book, and then they choose something that they're going to actually apply during the week. They call it an experiment, and they go home and they're supposed to go home and do something, kind of like an experiment, kind of like a laboratory, studying what happens if you do this, what happens if you go for a whole week without thinking anything negative about anybody else, or is it possible to go for a whole week without thinking anything negative, or you catch yourself.
The try, the try is important.
It's the try, right? So that's what Peter was talking about these about the study groups. I just wanted to explain that because not everybody, you and I know.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. I thought this was I remember you said this wasn't an ARE group, a community.
Right. Well, not necessarily. Yeah. But that's okay. It's all right. So anything further that, well, I there are two things I've been thinking about in terms of the revelation. One is, you referred to it, that line about how this generation will not pass away until all of these things have happened. And that is something that, puzzles a lot of people, because obviously the people around Jesus did pass away, and all the predicted things hadn't happened. So, but what you're saying is more like, it's not this generation in the sense of like 80 years. It's this generation in the sense of this age, like the Aquarian age, and that all the mess from the Aquarian age has to be cleaned up before we can go into the next age.
And I think that's the purpose that Jung and Edinger and myself and others have done this work, is to put it into perspective. I remember a professor in college said there's nothing that's more powerful than a way of looking at things. And so I think that it just puts into perspective the chaos that's going on, so that we don't get swept up in it, so that we can kind of have somewhat like, oh, okay, this is it's a birthing process. These are the birthing pains. There's different ways that we can look at it. The only problem is that you can either then detach and say, oh, this just needs to happen, so I'm just going to keep, working in my garden, versus this is what needs to happen, but let me stay involved. Let my presence be counted for righteousness in this time. Let me stay aware of what's going on. Let me of course, pray and meditate, but also let me act from those prayers, meditate, see what I can do that would help my brothers and sisters that are suffering at this time. So I think that's the purpose, is that we come to some understanding what's going on, have some hope, and see that our tries, like we were saying earlier, they count for righteousness, that they're worthy, whether it's through how we vote, it's for what protests we show up at, it's who we stand up for when when it matters, and when we have the opportunity.
So that's the harder road, because it's easy to either be tipped over into rage and even violence, or to just say, I can't deal with it. I'm just gonna go sit in my study and read my books, or work in
Yeah.
my garden and forget about all of that. And I see people doing both of those things around me, and I also see myself struggling to try to not do either one of those things. To try to find the I guess you would call it the path of Christ consciousness. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. Here she comes again. She's quite restless.
And I guess the work that I do with regression that you were talking about earlier, I think that also helps people get a personal revelation, like, so that what you and I are talking about is maybe collective, like you're saying. It's not catered to the individual. And in a regression, a person can tap into their own place in all of this, and then it can tap into what they might be here to do about what's going on. So that's where I feel like, in my day-to-day work, working with people individually with regressions, helping them tap into their subconscious, and then in teaching people how to do this if they want to, with their friends, or even as a career. So that's where I feel that I've poured my life force energy into.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to say that I had the sense that in your presentations about the archetype of the apocalypse, and in your suggesting that as a topic tonight for our interview, you are sort of trying to bring people along to being part of that remnant. Would that not be so? That remnant that
Yes.
is
Yes.
conscious, and
Yes.
that kind of helps to mitigate the.
Because I think you lose, you can lose your participation as a remnant if you buy into the fear. Like, if you get into the fear and it's us versus them, if you a lot of times just tuning into the media, it's manipulative. And so a lot of times you can get sucked in to kind of a negative collective. And so, yes, I do think that the work that we're talking about is useful. It's about being able to not tap into that. So you have a sense of not fear. Like, I think that when people are afraid, they lose the Christ consciousness, because then they become self-protected rather than thinking of the collective.
So we only have a few minutes left. So let's talk about your past life regression course that's coming up. Do you still have some openings in that course?
I do. I don't know when this is broadcast, but there's one that just starts the day after tomorrow. But I have another one that starts in October, and then I do them like twice a year. So people can go to my website, peterwoodbury.com, and they can find out about what I do, the tours like you had mentioned, and other opportunities if there's anything I've said that was interesting.
peterwoodbury.com. So you have a past life regression course coming up very soon, and another one in a few months. And very briefly, let's talk about your tours that are coming up. There's one to Turkey in September.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then next year I'll be going to Egypt again and Peru again. And they're spiritually based travel. So we go to sacred sites, and we meet and have classes before we travel together. So the group doesn't meet each other at an airport in Cairo. They've had usually a few months of meeting weekly together, to get to know each other, to work together, to pray and meditate together. Each of them to understand why they want to go on the trip at this time. I do a lot of regression work building up to it, so they have conscious and a tap into their subconscious reasons for going to these sites at this time. And then it's, you go and you touch the temples, you touch the stones, and you receive energy, and it's a group where people can talk about that sort of thing. So they're not historical tours, even though of course we do have to have guides that give you the known history of the countries and the sites. But we're more interested in the metaphysical history and the metaphysical contexts of these places that we're visiting. So again, Turkey, the main site is Göbekli Tepe that you've heard about, that one of the oldest places of worship that they found.
Those gatherings that you have before the tour, those would be by Zoom. They would be online.
Yes, by Zoom.
Okay.
I think that's one of the things that makes my tours different, is that people meet ahead of time.
So why don't you give your website again?
It's just my name.com, Peter, Peter, and Woodbury is Wood, and then BURY.com.
Okay. All right. So, and if you're interested in having a past life regression, or learning how to do past life regression, or going on one of these tours, contact Peter. And if you want to reach me, you can contact me through the New York Edgar Casey Center. The email there is info@edgarcaseynyc.org. I'm going to spell that because a lot of people don't spell Casey correctly. It's not like Casey at the back. It's info@EDGARCAYCENYC.org. So thank you so much, Peter. This has been interesting and
Thank you.
And helpful, I think, for me. Because we're all trying to find our way through
Sure.
The world apparently kind of falling apart around us. So thank you. This has been hopeful and helpful. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you both for a very informative and insightful program. This will be up on YouTube and with a link on Facebook by tomorrow afternoon.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you both.
You.
Thank you,
All right,
everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.